streets of Portland that June evening were quiet, though the city never truly slept. The sun had long disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the sky bruised with shades of violet and indigo, the streetlights glinting on wet asphalt from an afternoon rain. There was a hum to the city, soft, unassuming, almost ordinary, the kind of ordinary that lulls you into believing nothing extraordinary, nothing dangerous could happen. But the ordinary, as it often does, is a fragile thing, and sometimes the smallest misstep, the tiniest oversight, can unravel it entirely. Ethan Cole moved through those streets with the ease of someone who belonged there, who knew every curve of the sidewalks, the smell of coffee wafting from the corner diner, the muffled laughter of bar patrons drifting out into the night. He was 25, recently graduated, newly employed in a junior analyst role at a modest but respectable firm downtown. Life, by all outward appearances, was routine, stable, and ordinary. And yet that stability, that sense of safety, was about to be shattered. Ethan had grown up in a quiet neighborhood not far from the heart of the city. Brick houses with manicured lawns, fire escapes winding up the side of apartment buildings, the occasional neon sign flickering in a storefront window. It was a neighborhood that whispered of predictability and comfort. He was a careful man by nature, thoughtful, almost cautious, yet with a warmth that made him well-liked among colleagues and neighbors alike. His parents, still living in the same house where Ethan had grown up, cherished him, and his younger sister, still in high school, often teased him about being too careful, though she admired his quiet sense of responsibility. On this particular Tuesday evening, Ethan had done something he rarely did. He allowed himself a night out, a break from the routine grind of spreadsheets and meetings. The office had been unremarkable that day, as it often was, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as he sorted data and filed reports with meticulous care. His coworkers were polite, cordial, but none lingered beyond necessary conversation. The office was efficient, a machine of quiet, predictable tasks. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, Ethan felt the kind of relief that comes from leaving behind monotony, stepping out into the world that seemed alive, even as the shadows lengthened and the city settled into its evening rhythm. He stopped by the local diner first, ordering a black coffee and a slice of cherry pie. The diner was empty, save for a few regulars nursing late dinners and a waitress who had worked there long enough to know the city's pulse without needing to look at a clock. Ethan sat by the window, watching the street glisten, the headlights of passing cars flickering across the puddles. The smell of rain-soaked asphalt mixed with coffee and pie. A combination that was small, comforting, and entirely mundane. He thought about calling his parents to check in, about how his sister would probably tease him for staying out late, but he shook his head and smiled to himself, deciding to savor the quiet, the anonymity of being just another face in Portland's evening crowd. From there, he wandered a few blocks toward a local bar, one he had been meaning to try for weeks. The neon open sign buzzed softly as he pushed through the door, the scent of spilled beer and fried food hitting him immediately. The hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft rock playing from speakers behind the bar created a sense of warmth, almost like a cocoon. Ethan ordered a beer, nodded politely to the bartender, and found a seat near the back where he could observe without being observed. He liked being able to watch, to notice small details. The way people smiled at one another, the nervous tapping of a foot, the way someone's eyes lingered just a fraction too long on another patron. It was here, among the low laughter and the casual conversations, that he noticed her. She was sitting at the end of the bar, a woman with chestnut hair and a quiet confidence, reading a tattered paperback and sipping from a glass of white wine. There was something ordinary about her too, yet something compelling, magnetic, a subtle pull that made Ethan glance more than once. He wasn't a man prone to impulsive decisions, yet something about that evening, the hum of the bar, the dim lighting, the anonymity of the crowd, made him consider a small, reckless gesture. He approached her, introduced himself with a cautious smile, and they exchanged small talk, laughter, and eventually shared stories that would have seemed inconsequential to anyone else, but were the very threads that would soon bind him to a fate he could never have imagined. Hours passed like minutes. The city outside grew quieter, the streets stretching long and empty under the glow of street lamps. Ethan didn't notice the subtle glances, the way the bartender occasionally scanned the doorway as if expecting someone, or the sleek black car parked just down the block, engine off, shadowed under a tree. The ordinary hum of Portland at night concealed the extraordinary events that were quietly closing in on him. Eventually, Ethan left the bar with her, walking a few blocks toward the apartment he had rented in a building 2 avenues over. They talked softly, laughed at minor jokes, the kind that seemed trivial at the moment, but later echo with significance. He held the door open for her at the entrance, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in months. The rare feeling of connection, of possibility, of human warmth. He didn't know then, of course, that the woman he had just met had a life and a history that would change everything. That her husband, a wealthy, mysterious man with resources Ethan could never have imagined, would soon know of this encounter. That this small, innocent night would become the spark that ignited a chain of events darker than anything he could have anticipated. But for now, Ethan's mind was occupied with the mundane. Unlocking his door, stepping inside, settling his jacket on the hook, pouring a glass of water. He checked the mailbox, noticed it was empty, and shrugged, thinking nothing of it. The city hummed quietly outside, and for one fleeting moment, everything seemed normal. He moved through his apartment with the ease of someone who felt secure, unthreatened. The pale light from the kitchen window fell across the counter where a half-empty coffee mug waited from the morning. He thought of tomorrow, of the office, of his sister, of the mundane continuity of life. He flicked off the lights in the living room and moved to lock the door. The key turned in the lock, and for an instant, he paused. A chill ran up his spine, subtle, almost imperceptible. Perhaps it was just the breeze slipping through the window. Perhaps it was nothing at all. Ethan slid the bolt into place, leaned back against the door, and let out a slow breath. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the life-altering events that were closing in, of the ordinary evening about to fracture into chaos. The neon signs hummed, a distant siren wailed, a car engine idled down the street, and he, unaware, felt a rare sense of calm. He moved to the couch, sinking into the cushions, and allowed himself one last quiet moment before sleep. The ordinary, the mundane, the stable life he had known was about to unravel in ways he could never predict. And just like that, the quiet of the night held a secret, a whisper of danger. For while Ethan Cole rested, oblivious, someone out there already knew his name, knew his face, and knew exactly where he would be. The ordinary world had shifted imperceptibly, and nothing would ever feel the same again. The key was in the lock, the door was bolted, the apartment was silent. And yet somewhere beyond the walls, shadows moved. Ethan did not know it yet, but the first step toward the darkness that would consume him was already being taken. The night had only just begun. The night had grown deeper, the city quieting into a rhythm of distant horns, occasional footsteps, and the faint hum of neon. Ethan Cole had drifted into a sense of safety, lulled by the comfort of routine, the familiar walls of his apartment, the hum of Portland outside. He didn't notice the figure across the street, in the shadow of a sleek black car, watching every movement. He didn't hear the soft click of the car door, the quiet approach through alleyways, the measured steps that belonged not to a stranger lost, but to a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Minutes after Ethan had locked the door behind him, he heard a knock. Light, deliberate, almost polite. He frowned, thinking of the woman from the bar, or a neighbor, perhaps a mistaken delivery. He opened the door a crack. There was no one. Just a shadow, gone as quickly as it had appeared. He shook his head, thinking it was his imagination, and stepped inside, sliding the deadbolt once more. Stillness returned. The city outside seemed no different than before, but danger had already crossed the threshold, unnoticed. Ethan had met the woman at the bar that evening, laughed with her, felt a fleeting connection, never imagining that connection would ignite a chain of events darker than any ordinary imagination could conjure. The truth was simple, devastating, and terrifying. She was married to a man who did not forgive, who demanded obedience, control, and absolute compliance. The husband had discovered Ethan's presence through small, meticulous observation. A bar receipt, a late-night phone call, a text he intercepted, and now his wrath had a target. The abduction was swift, brutal, and professional. The husband had means, resources, and patience. He knew Ethan's habits, his routines, his predictable movements. When Ethan was out of sight of his apartment building, a car pulled into the alley behind him. Two men emerged, silent, efficient, their approach unnoticed until the last possible moment. Ethan was grabbed. Resistance was futile. A struggle, brief but forceful, and then darkness. A hood, a hand pressed against his mouth, a jolt that knocked him to the ground. Fear surged like ice through his veins, a sensation more alive than anything he had felt in his ordinary life. He was blindfolded, driven to a location he would later only remember in fragments. A place distant enough from Portland to sever familiarity, yet close enough for the husband's control to remain absolute. The smell of damp earth, concrete, and machinery filled his senses as he was forced into a dimly lit room. Chains, locks, and harsh lighting greeted him. The man who had orchestrated this, tall, imposing, and calm in his own violent way, stood before him. There was no need for explanations. The punishment was implicit, understood without words. Ethan had trespassed in the sacred territory of wealth, pride, and control. The first night was chaos. Fear, confusion, and the raw instinct for survival overtook any rational thought. Ethan was stripped of identity, his wallet, his keys, his clothes taken, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. He was instructed to work, though the details of the labor were meaningless in the moment. Cleaning, carrying, running errands, menial tasks that were designed to break his spirit while exhausting his body. Food was sparse, measured, and demeaning. Starvation became routine. Sleep was a reward, not a right, and often interrupted by threats, shouting, or the sudden presence of a man whose wealth and power seemed infinite. Days merged into nights in a blur of hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Ethan learned to anticipate the husband's moods, to measure each word, each movement. Any misstep brought punishment. A belt across the back, a shove that sent him sprawling, verbal threats that echoed with menace long after the voice had left the room. The woman he had met at the bar became a distant, impossible memory, replaced in his mind by the immediacy of survival. She had unknowingly signed a sentence that would fracture his life, and Ethan realized with bitter clarity that innocence or ignorance had no place here. Only compliance mattered. Outside, Portland carried on. Friends called his apartment, puzzled by unanswered knocks. His sister worried when he didn't return home. The office noted his absence, sending emails and making calls that went unanswered. No one imagined the precision with which the wealthy husband had orchestrated the disappearance, or the quiet terror Ethan faced in his secret prison. The police, when alerted by the increasingly frantic family, found only his car parked where it shouldn't be. Doors locked, wallet inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues pointing to abduction, only the residue of absence. The media reported a missing person, treating the story as a young man who had perhaps walked away, lost in confusion or personal despair. Friends speculated, offered support, posted flyers, and called hotlines. But the truth, the cruel, meticulous orchestration of a man who refused forgiveness, a life reduced to labor, starvation, and fear, remained invisible to the outside world. Ethan's days became a rhythm of terror and compliance. He learned to suppress panic, to minimize his presence, to anticipate the unpredictable whims of his captor. He became hyper-aware, watching shadows, calculating the moments when a door opened or a step sounded, measuring the safest place to be at any given second. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, but more insidious was the mental erosion, the sense that he was invisible, powerless, expendable. The man who had taken him sought not murder initially, but ownership, control, a lesson in obedience delivered through pain and isolation. Weeks blurred into months. Ethan's body weakened, but his mind, though battered, retained fragments of clarity. He remembered the life he had left behind, the apartment, the streets, the city lights. But those memories felt distant, like glimpses of another world. He feared any attempt at escape, knowing that failure would mean death. The husband's reach seemed infinite, omnipresent, and Ethan internalized the warning. No one is looking for you. You are alone. Yet even in despair, the human instinct for survival persisted. Each small detail became critical: a loose window latch, a weak door hinge, a momentary distraction by one of the husband's men. Ethan's mind, owned by months of fear, began to calculate, to plan, to imagine a route to freedom. It was dangerous, almost impossible, but desperation breeds ingenuity. And so, the ordinary life Ethan Cole had known, the coffee mornings, the office chatter, the laughter shared with strangers, the quiet evenings in his apartment, was gone, replaced by a world defined by darkness, hunger, fear, and a singular focus: survival. The city he had loved, the streets he had walked with ease, had become a memory, a distant echo of safety he could not reach. The night stretched long. The hum of the city outside his windowless prison was nothing more than a whisper, a reminder that the world carried on without him. In the quiet moments between labor and punishment, Ethan imagined escape, not just from the room, but from the relentless fear, the shadows that clung to him, the man who had taken everything. It was a dangerous thought, a forbidden one, but in his mind it was also the only spark of hope. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the edges of the sky, Ethan had made a decision. He would survive. He would escape. The world outside might not welcome him. It might not even notice him. But he would not remain a prisoner, not for long. And so, in the quiet aftermath of another night of fear, he began to plan, observing every detail, learning every routine, counting the hours until the moment he would risk everything. The ordinary world he had once known, the safety, the predictability, the normalcy, was gone. In its place was a harsh, unforgiving reality that would define him, reshape him, and test the very limits of his mind and body. The first step toward freedom, toward survival, had already begun. Ethan Cole, once an ordinary young man in a quiet Portland neighborhood, was about to confront the darkness of a world he had never imagined. And the world outside, bustling and unaware, continued on, ignorant of the storm that had descended upon one life, one ordinary life that would never be ordinary again. By the time Portland woke the following morning, Ethan Cole had already been missing for hours. The city itself seemed unaware of the fracture in one of its ordinary lives. The office workers arrived, the trams rolled, and the early sunlight glinted off rain-washed streets. But for the Cole family, the day had begun in tension and dread. His apartment door was locked, just as it had been the night before. But inside there was no movement, no warmth, no sign of life. The wallet, untouched, sat on the counter as though mocking the absence of its owner. His sister was the first to notice. She had called him repeatedly that morning, messages stacking one atop the other. When there was no answer, worry gnawed at her, growing into panic. She remembered how punctual he was, how rarely he missed a day of work. Something was wrong, and instinct screamed louder than logic. By the time their parents arrived, frazzled and concerned, the apartment felt too quiet, too empty, as if the walls themselves had exhaled in the absence of the young man they loved. Detectives were called in, the kind who had seen missing person cases before, and yet each case had its own hue, its own texture, and Ethan's was immediately different. There was no note, no sign of struggle, no clues left behind, only the echo of a life abruptly suspended. Officers walked through the apartment carefully, cataloging what they could. A neatly folded jacket on a chair, the coffee mug still half full, the faint smell of the cherry pie he had eaten the night before. Nothing suggested a voluntary departure. And yet, without evidence, the theory of a walk-off could not be dismissed outright. The investigation began in the neighborhoods he frequented. Friends and co-workers were interviewed, their memories and alibis recorded in careful handwriting in manila folders. He didn't seem stressed, one colleague noted. He was the same as always. Another friend mentioned he had seemed tired, distracted, but nothing that would indicate fear or impending danger. Small, seemingly inconsequential details, the kind that often hide truths beneath them, were recorded and filed, waiting for context that never came in those early days. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the disappearance. Local news anchors spoke in measured tones, highlighting the normalcy of Ethan's life and the oddity of his sudden absence. Flyers were printed, photos stapled to telephone poles, handbills distributed in cafes and stores. For a moment, hope flickered. People remembered the Cole family, remembered the smiling young man who had studied hard, worked diligently, and carried himself with quiet dignity. And yet, as days turned to weeks, the trail grew cold. The initial weeks were marked by minor frustrations. A man matching Ethan's description was reportedly seen near the waterfront. A tipster claimed he had boarded a bus heading south. Police investigated, canvassing buses and terminals, only to find no evidence. Each dead end eroded optimism, replaced by an unspoken, creeping fear. Perhaps the young man was no longer able to help himself. Perhaps something terrible had already occurred. Within the police department, Detective Sergeant Raymond Callahan, a veteran with more years behind him than ahead, took a personal interest in the case. He wasn't a man prone to dramatics, but something about the clean absence of struggle, the locked department, the untouched wallet, suggested to him that the walk-off theory didn't hold water. He kept the case file close, revisiting it in the quiet hours of the night, poring over interview transcripts, rechecking timelines, replaying witness statements. Each reread brought frustration, small inconsistencies, and a gnawing sense of incompleteness. At home, the Cole family's days blurred into a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. Meals went uneaten, beds went unmade, phone calls went unanswered. The parents slept in shifts, one awake while the other rested, each listening for the sound of footsteps on the pavement, a knock at the door, anything that might signal his return. Friends offered support, neighbors inquired, yet comfort was elusive. The city continued its rhythms around them, indifferent, while their world had contracted to a single, urgent question. Where was Ethan? False leads became both a curse and a lifeline. A man in Florida claimed to have spotted a young man resembling Ethan, wandering near a motel late at night. Calls poured in, tips flowed from other states, but each ended the same way. No confirmation, no trace, only the fading hope that maybe, somewhere, he was alive. Sergeant Callahan chased some of these leads personally, driving long stretches of highway, making cold calls, yet each effort seemed to vanish into a fog of uncertainty. The young man's image, once so familiar, became fragmented, as if time itself had begun to erode the edges of his existence. Yet, even amidst the frustration, small details were noted. There had been an unexplained withdrawal from Ethan's bank account, a large sum that didn't match his normal spending. A phone message, deleted by a well-meaning relative, hinted at confusion or distress. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. But the pieces sat in the detective's mind like puzzle fragments, waiting for context that had not yet arrived. As the weeks turned to months, the police began to classify the case as a cold missing person situation rather than an active criminal investigation. The public attention faded, flyers yellowed in the rain, posters curled at the edges, and the family's anguish became private grief. Sergeant Callahan, however, refused to shelve the file completely. He kept it tucked into a drawer, pulling it out during quiet moments, studying the patterns, wondering if some small, overlooked clue might one day illuminate the truth. The emotional weight on the family was immense. Ethan's parents could barely sleep. His mother cried herself to exhaustion. His father walked the house late at night, replaying every conversation, every moment, wondering if he had missed a warning sign. The sister, too young to fully grasp the gravity, carried a fragile hope that he might return, her adolescence overshadowed by the absent presence of a brother who had once been a constant in her life. Portland itself became a silent witness to their suffering. The city's streets continued, pedestrians moving along sidewalks without knowledge of the invisible storm that had entered the Cole family's lives. Business carried on. Children played in backyards, and the ordinary sounds of daily life contrasted sharply with the private, invisible terror unfolding within the family's heart. By the end of the second month, the police had exhausted most immediate leads. Calls to bars, taxi drivers, bus stations, all produced nothing. No fingerprints, no stolen goods, no ransom demands. Sergeant Callahan stared at the empty apartment photos, the blank spaces in the timeline, the missing hours, and felt a gnawing certainty that something far more sinister had occurred. Yet without proof, without evidence, he was left with suspicion and instinct, alone against a wall of ambiguity. Even in the absence of answers, hope persisted, fragile as a candle in the wind. Friends continued to leave messages, family members called in to ask, to plead, to demand action. And somewhere in the shadows, the truth, dark, personal, and terrifying, waited. The wealthy husband, the unseen force behind the abduction, had ensured that Ethan Cole's disappearance would be nearly invisible to the world, masked by the mundane, covered by silence. For the city and the family, the days became a tense suspension. Every sound, every shadow, every stranger on the street was a potential lead, a potential threat, a potential revelation. But nothing came. The ordinary world continued its indifference, and the extraordinary terror remained hidden, waiting. And yet, Sergeant Callahan refused to abandon hope. He continued to return to the manila folder, rereading interviews, replaying timelines, scrutinizing every detail. Somewhere, buried in plain sight, was a clue. Somewhere, the truth of Ethan Cole's disappearance waited for recognition. And in the quiet, he resolved that he would find it. No matter how long it took, no matter how many dead ends he faced, no matter how invisible the world had made the young man who had vanished without a trace. Months turned into years. The city of Portland carried on, indifferent to the slow-burning tragedy that had quietly crept into one family's life. Streetlights blinked on and off as seasons changed, rain gave way to the hot summer sun, and the ordinary rhythm of the city marched forward, uncaring, unaware. Inside the Cole family home, however, time had lost its predictability. Days blended into nights, and nights into weeks, the calendar only a cruel reminder of absence. Ethan's parents lived suspended in that limbo, their grief heavy and unrelenting. Meals were often skipped, the table set for a man who no longer came home. They answered phones with a hollow politeness, fearing yet hoping for a miracle that never arrived. Friends visited less often, unsure how to comfort them, and the neighbors whispered but never intruded. The house, once lively with laughter and mundane conversation, had become a shrine to uncertainty. A monument to the invisible presence of a son who had vanished without warning. Sergeant Raymond Callahan carried the case like a private burden. The department's files grew dusty, the case marked as a cold missing person investigation, but he refused to shelve the manila folder completely. In the quiet hours of the night, after the city had drifted into sleep, he would pull the folder from the bottom drawer of his desk, tracing timelines with a pen, rereading witness statements, and examining photographs that held fragments of a life stolen away. Each visit to the folder brought a mixture of frustration and hope. Something about the neat apartment, the untouched wallet, and the absence of struggle suggested the walk-off theory was a lie. He knew Ethan had been taken. He simply didn't yet know by whom or why. The early leads had long since grown cold, but Sergeant Callahan's instincts refused to die. He kept notes on minor inconsistencies, an unexplained withdrawal from Ethan's bank account, the fleeting mention of a mysterious woman in an interview, the strange absence of any report from the bars Ethan frequented that night. Each tiny detail felt like a breadcrumb, a clue leading toward a truth that was painfully obscured. He would close the folder, stare at the ceiling, and imagine the young man's life suspended somewhere, unseen, unheard, untouchable. Meanwhile, in a location far removed from the city's awareness, Ethan Cole endured a reality the world could not imagine. The wealthy husband's control was absolute. The routine of forced labor and starvation persisted with mechanical precision. Each day was a cycle of fear, obedience, and survival. Months of physical deprivation had transformed his body, isolation had reshaped his mind. Sleep was fractured, dreams haunted by shadows, and any memory of ordinary life seemed both distant and fragile. He learned to measure every step, every breath, anticipating punishment before it arrived. The man who had taken him ensured that no one could trace him, leaving no trace, no evidence, and no hope of discovery. In the city, the police investigation slowed, the media lost interest, and Portland settled into the false comfort of routine. Yet for Sergeant Callahan, the case was never closed. He became a quiet, almost obsessive presence in the missing person files. Every few months, he would pull the manila folder, reading and rereading every word, looking for angles no one else considered. He traced routes Ethan might have taken, revisited surveillance notes, and mapped neighborhoods with an obsessive precision. To colleagues, he seemed stubborn. To himself, he was diligent, the last barrier between the truth and complete erasure. The Cole family, meanwhile, began to internalize the absence. Days were spent in quiet reflection, evenings consumed by the hum of the city outside windows that looked onto streets now familiar and empty. The parents talked in hushed tones, fearing to speak the words aloud. He may never come back. The sister, growing older, learned to manage grief in silence, carrying her brother's absence like a private ache. Friends attempted consolation, but the weight of years without answers had hardened the edges of hope into something fragile, almost dangerous. False sightings continued to plague Sergeant Callahan. Reports of a man resembling Ethan surfaced sporadically from California, Washington, and even as far as Florida. Each tip became a lead to chase. Each lead ended in disappointment. He drove long stretches of highway, made countless phone calls, but each effort seemed to dissolve into the fog of uncertainty. And yet, he persisted. He could not accept that a man who had vanished under suspicious circumstances could simply disappear without cause. Ethan, meanwhile, began to change. Years of captivity, starvation, and labor had left him both physically weakened and mentally fragile. The predictable terror of the wealthy husband's dominance had reshaped his instincts. Hypervigilance became second nature. The once ordinary young man, who had navigated city streets with ease and confidence, now learned to move quietly, to anticipate danger in shadows, and to suppress his own thoughts when necessary. He became a ghost within his own life, unseen and unheard, a man eroded by trauma. The psychological toll was immense. Memories of his family and former life flickered like faint lights, reminders of warmth and safety that felt impossible to grasp. Paranoia crept into his mind. He began to believe the world had forgotten him entirely, that nobody was looking, that any attempt at returning would only invite danger. In this fragile mental state, survival became both a strategy and a necessity, guiding every thought, every movement, every breath. Back in Portland, Sergeant Callahan's persistence began to set the foundation for eventual discovery. He maintained a quiet vigilance, returning to old interviews, revisiting leads that had once seemed irrelevant. He spoke with former co-workers, friends, anyone who might remember a detail overlooked. He reconstructed the timeline meticulously, noting gaps and inconsistencies, questioning assumptions the initial investigation had made. Over time, his patience and dedication formed a latticework of insight, the quiet scaffolding of eventual resolution. The Cole family, meanwhile, continued to struggle with grief and uncertainty. Ethan's parents sold his room's belongings after the mandated legal period to declare him deceased. The apartment became a ghost house, empty and echoing, a place of both mourning and stubborn hope. Even as the legalities of loss were addressed, the emotional weight of uncertainty remained. Each day carried a quiet ache, the reminder that a life once ordinary had been abruptly stolen, leaving only questions and shadows. Years passed. Sergeant Callahan watched quietly, documenting patterns, filing notes, and holding on to the conviction that Ethan Cole had been taken, and that the truth, though buried, had not vanished. The false leads, the whispers of sightings, the dead ends, they were frustrating, but also hints that some thread still existed, some clue waiting for the right moment. Ethan, trapped in isolation, continued to endure. The wealthy husband's control persisted, yet cracks began to emerge. Small moments where security faltered, routines broke, attention waned. These moments, fleeting though they were, planted the seeds of possibility in Ethan's mind. The faintest glimmer of escape, a dangerous hope that he clung to with the desperation of someone whose life had been reduced to shadows and fear. And in the quiet spaces between punishment, labor, and fear, Ethan began to imagine freedom, not as a fantasy, but as a plan. Small observations, subtle details, and careful memorization allowed him to see openings where before there had been none. The young man who had walked Portland streets with ease had been broken, reshaped by trauma, but the instinct for survival persisted. The city outside remained oblivious. Portland carried on in its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the human storm that had been raging quietly for years. The office where Ethan had worked continued its quiet efficiency. Friends moved on, and the Cole family endured their private grief. Sergeant Callahan, alone in his quiet office at night, studied timelines and photographs, driven by the conviction that the invisible thread linking all these years of absence could not be ignored. The cold years were harsh, relentless, and unyielding, but they also laid the groundwork for the eventual reckoning. Patterns would emerge, opportunities for escape would present themselves. And somewhere in the city, the ordinary world and the extraordinary nightmare of one young man's abduction would eventually collide once more. Time passed, and Ethan's endurance became both remarkable and tragic. The young man who had once sipped coffee in a quiet diner, laughed at bar tables and walked home safely, now existed in a world of shadows, threats, and fear. His body bore the marks of starvation and forced labor. His mind carried the invisible scars of trauma and isolation. And yet, despite the physical and psychological toll, he survived. Survival, after all, was the first step toward eventual liberation. And though years had passed in darkness, Ethan Cole's story was far from over. Somewhere, beyond the walls of isolation, beyond the silence of Portland, the possibility of escape, of return, of reckoning waited quietly, an ember smoldering beneath the ashes of fear. The opportunity came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the rhythm of days that had long since become predictable. Ethan had spent years memorizing the routines, learning the patterns of those who controlled him. He knew the slightest lapse could mean death, and yet he had survived, endured starvation, fear, and labor that crushed both body and spirit. Now, after countless nights spent imagining freedom in the shadows of his prison, he saw the opening. A door left slightly ajar, a guard distracted by a call, a routine that faltered for mere seconds. But those seconds were enough. He didn't hesitate. Survival instincts, honed and sharpened by years of oppression, took over. He slipped through the narrow space, heart hammering, muscles aching from years of undernourishment, but determination fueling each step. The corridor stretched long, shadows dancing in the dim light, and every sound was a potential death sentence. But he moved with silent precision, memorized every turn, and avoided detection. Each step brought him closer to the world outside, the world he had believed had forgotten him. When he finally emerged into the night air, it was a shock, a sensory overload he had long ago ceased to feel. The cold wind bit into his skin, carrying the sense of trees, wet asphalt, and the distant city beyond. Freedom was not comforting. It was overwhelming. For a moment he froze, lungs burning, chest pounding, mind racing with disbelief. He was outside, alive, and yet the streets that should have promised safety were foreign, harsh, and unwelcoming. Ethan had no home to return to. No family could know where he was. Not yet. Years of captivity, threats, and the rich husband's omnipresent wrath had instilled a fear that silenced every impulse to seek familiar faces. He remembered the warnings. No one is looking for you. You are invisible. And so, with only the clothes on his back and the shadow of years of trauma, he vanished into the city that had once been familiar, now transformed into a labyrinth of danger and uncertainty. The first days were brutal. Hunger gnawed constantly, fatigue clung like a second skin, and the cold nights offered no respite. He slept in alleys, abandoned buildings, and under overpasses, each space a temporary refuge that could disappear with the coming dawn. People passed by without recognition, eyes sliding past him as though he were already invisible. In some ways it was liberation, in others it was terrifying. He had survived captivity, but the streets demanded more than endurance. They demanded adaptation, cunning, and a capacity to vanish into the edges of society. Ethan's mind, already fragile from years of abuse, began to fracture further, sleep-deprived, malnourished, and haunted by memories of the wealthy husband's control. He saw threats where there were none. Shadows became predators, strangers were potential enemies, and every corner concealed danger. The mental erosion of isolation deepened, leaving a man who had once been bright, organized, and orderly, now living in fragmented reality. Conversations with himself became commonplace, a way to maintain some semblance of control, to remind himself that he still existed, that he still survived. Despite the hardship, he learned to navigate this new world. He scavenged for food, bartered for shelter, and avoided places where he might be recognized. He became a ghost within Portland, walking the streets with careful attention, retreating from anyone who might question him, anyone who might pry too closely. Over time, he discovered small pockets of community among others like him. Homeless individuals who had learned the rules of survival, who moved silently in and out of the city's underbelly. He observed, learned, and adopted behaviors that allowed him to exist without detection. Yet survival was not just physical. The psychological toll of captivity and isolation had left deep scars. He was haunted by the man who had controlled him, by the memory of fear, by the erosion of his own sense of self. Trust had been obliterated. Hope had been buried beneath years of labor, hunger, and intimidation. He feared approaching anyone, fearing judgment, recognition, or reprisal. Every interaction was weighed against potential danger, every gesture considered for its risk. Even safety was relative, fragile, temporary. The city became both sanctuary and prison. He navigated the streets with the precision of someone who had no margin for error. Alleys and abandoned buildings became maps in his mind, places where he could sleep unseen, eat unnoticed, and vanish before dawn. The ordinary rhythms of Portland, the sounds of traffic, the hum of trams, the chatter of neighborhoods, were both comforting and alien. He was part of the world, yet entirely apart from it. Existing on the edges is where society forgot to look. As months passed, the routine of survival hardened him. He became hyper-vigilant, capable of sensing danger before it appeared, instinctively knowing when to move, when to hide, when to remain invisible. His body, once weakened, began to adjust, muscles taut from constant vigilance, senses sharpened by necessity. Yet the mind remained brittle. Memories of captivity intruded in dreams and waking hours, a constant reminder of the man who had stolen years from him. Paranoia and suspicion became companions, voices in the dark that whispered threats and warnings, shaping every choice. The city society overlooked him, yet he observed it keenly. Shops, diners, libraries, even the familiar streets of his old neighborhood. He moved like a shadow, unseen but always watching. Every person became a study in caution, every interaction a potential risk. His prior life, the office job, the family dinners, the laughter with friends, felt like a different person, a life erased by years of torment. The man who had escaped captivity was no longer the Ethan Cole Portland had once known. He was a survivor, a ghost, a figure moving through shadows, defined by trauma and the singular desire to remain unseen. In these years, Sergeant Callahan continued his quiet vigil. The case, cold and unsolved in the eyes of the world, remained active in his mind. He revisited interviews, traced leads, and considered every missed detail, every seemingly trivial fact, knowing that missing person cases rarely resolve in neat packages. He never imagined, however, the depth of trauma Ethan had endured, the transformation that years of forced labor, starvation, and fear would bring. When Ethan finally re-emerged into the world, he would be alive, yet irrevocably changed, haunted, fragile, unstable, and unable to return to the life he had once known. Ethan's existence became a careful balance of survival and invisibility. He was a man in hiding, yet no one was actively hunting him. He had escaped the physical prison, but the psychological chains remained. Fear dictated decisions, paranoia colored perception, and the memory of the wealthy husband's power lingered in every shadow. Portland, a city he had once navigated with ease, was now a maze of threats and safe havens, familiar streets rendered strange by trauma. He rarely approached the idea of home. The thought of his family, once comforting, now seemed impossible, fraught with guilt, fear, and uncertainty. He feared what they would think, feared judgment, feared that their lives had moved on without him. Even the simplest human connections became dangerous. Friends, co-workers, family, they existed in a different world, one that had no bearing on his immediate survival. He had become untethered, a man adrift in the edges of society, surviving yet never truly living. Years of invisibility began to solidify into identity. Ethan Cole, once an ordinary young man, had become someone entirely new. The trauma, the isolation, the relentless fear, all had reshaped him into a survivor who could move unseen, exist without recognition, and endure hardships unimaginable to most. Yet, beneath the exterior of survival, there remained fragments of memory, faint echoes of the life that had been stolen. They were painful, yes, but they were also the only proof that he had once been someone ordinary, someone loved, someone known. And so, life on the streets continued. Ethan moved silently, surviving on the edge of society, haunted by the past, terrified of recognition, and incapable of returning to a world he had once been part of. The wealthy husband's reach, though no longer direct, had left scars that would not heal quickly. He had escaped captivity, but the freedom he had fought for came with consequences: invisibility, instability, and the psychological weight of years lost. And still, despite everything, he survived. Against hunger, fear, and trauma, the instinct for life endured. Ethan Cole existed in the shadows of Portland, a ghost in a city that no longer knew him, and perhaps would never understand what had been taken from him. Years had passed, and Ethan Cole had become part of the city's invisible underworld. Portland's streets, alleys, and abandoned buildings were no longer terrifying. They were home. He moved like a shadow, unseen and unnoticed, surviving on scraps, foraging, and the quiet cooperation of others who, like him, had been erased from ordinary society. Yet even in this invisibility, he carried scars that had not faded. Trauma shaped every decision, every glance, every step he took. His mind, fragile from years of captivity and abuse, constantly replayed the horrors he had endured. Every shadow was a threat, every stranger a potential danger. It was a cold, gray morning when the first faint glimmer of discovery occurred. Ethan had found temporary shelter in a small underpass near the waterfront, where the river glinted like steel under the overcast sky. He had spent the night wrapped in tattered blankets, body stiff from the cold, mind restless with fragments of memories that were half nightmares, half longing. As he emerged from his sleeping spot, he noticed a man standing nearby, a young patrol officer on routine duty, eyes scanning the area for signs of trouble or trespass. Ethan froze instinctively. Years of fear had taught him to vanish, to blend, to avoid recognition at all costs. But there was something about the officer's glance, curiosity rather than threat, that caught him off guard. The young man's eyes lingered for a fraction longer than expected, and in that instant, Ethan felt the subtle, terrifying weight of being seen. He did not know if recognition had occurred, or if it was merely human curiosity, but the feeling ignited a nervous, instinctive reaction. He retreated silently, slipping into the shadows, moving with the precision of years spent surviving in fear. He had become an expert at remaining invisible. Yet, despite his skills, a fragment of instinct told him that he could not completely disappear this time. Something had shifted, a small anomaly in routine that suggested observation, attention, awareness. It was a sensation he had not felt in years, a flicker of danger and possibility entwined. The officer, meanwhile, had noted something unusual. A man, dirty, unkempt, yet with a faint familiarity in posture, gait, or mannerisms, had passed through the underpass. There was no identification, no photograph, nothing to track him by, only the sense that this was someone out of place, someone who had perhaps slipped between the cracks of ordinary life. The officer made a note in his journal, routine yet cautious, unaware of the deep history behind the figure he had glimpsed. Days later, Ethan encountered subtle interactions that hinted at the world beginning to notice him again. Cafes and diners became places to observe from afar, the warmth and normalcy of human life both alluring and dangerous. He noticed glances, brief conversations, the way people paused and adjusted their path in the streets. These were not direct confrontations, they were almost imperceptible, but they triggered the constant, simmering tension of his existence. The city had begun to register his presence, and he had become conscious of it in ways he had not been in years. Even so, he remained careful. The trauma of years of captivity had instilled a hypervigilance that bordered on paranoia. He avoided cameras, sidestepped potential observers, and never lingered long in any one place. The streets had become both sanctuary and prison. Each day was a calculated dance between survival and invisibility. Yet beneath the layers of fear, a faint ember of curiosity began to stir, a cautious recognition that someone, somewhere, might begin to understand what had happened to him. This glimmer of discovery was not sensational. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting, no immediate rescue. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight note in a patrol officer's log, a lingering glance from someone passing by, a fragment of attention in a city that had mostly forgotten him. For Ethan, it was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. He had survived against impossible odds. And now, the first hints that the world was acknowledging his existence since his disappearance began to appear. Back in the shadows, Sergeant Callahan had not forgotten him either. Though years had passed, he continued to revisit the manila folder, tracing timelines, considering overlooked details, and occasionally allowing himself to hope that the missing young man might still be alive. He did not yet know that Ethan had survived captivity or that he now existed as a ghost within the city. But instinct, honed over decades, told him that this case was far from resolved. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the truth awaited recognition. Ethan's mental state remained precarious. Trauma had rewritten his perceptions of safety and threat. Everyday life, something most took for granted, was now a constant negotiation between desire and fear. He longed for connection, for warmth, for human contact, yet the possibility of harm or recognition prevented him from reaching out. He had been invisible for so long that he did not yet know how to re-emerge, how to navigate ordinary society safely. The years of isolation had forged survival habits that were now both his strength and his prison. Interactions, when they occurred, were tense and fragmented. People noticed his presence, but he remained elusive. Small acts of kindness, a passerby offering a meal, a worker leaving food near his sleeping spot, were accepted cautiously, warily, as if the world itself might hide betrayal behind generosity. Every step was a negotiation, every glance a calculated risk. He had survived years of captivity, yet the streets now tested him in a different way, an unrelenting vigilance against threats that might not even exist. The city became a tapestry of safe zones and danger zones. Shadows and light, opportunity and risk. Ethan moved carefully, memorizing patterns, avoiding detection, and learning to navigate a world that had long since assumed he was gone. Each day was a struggle, each night a trial, and each moment of freedom carried the weight of years lost. Yet in these subtle interactions, these faint glimmers of observation, the first seeds of possibility were planted, a slow, delicate recognition that he was no longer entirely invisible. The patrol officer, though initially unaware, began to connect subtle threads over time. He noticed patterns, slight repetitions in movement, the consistency of Ethan's avoidance, and the faint human traces left behind, sleeping spots, discarded possessions, gestures of existence that suggested persistence. Nothing definitive existed yet, no clue to his identity, no immediate rescue, but the first glimmers of awareness were there. And sometimes, awareness is the first step toward change. For Ethan, these encounters ignited a complex mix of fear and hope. He feared exposure, recognition, and the possibility of danger still lurking. But he also began to sense that survival alone might no longer be the only goal. Perhaps slowly, cautiously, he might navigate toward reintegration, not yet with family, not yet fully, but toward some semblance of life that included recognition, safety, and even trust. And in the quiet, hidden corners of the city, he continued to observe the world around him, the ordinary Portland life, the routines of strangers, the subtle patterns that had once been familiar and now felt alien. He remained a ghost, yet the city's faint acknowledgement of his presence suggested that the invisible walls were beginning to shift. The stage was set. The years of trauma, the careful survival, the hypervigilance, and the invisibility had prepared him for this moment. The faint glimmer of discovery was small, almost imperceptible, yet it was enough. It suggested that the world was beginning to notice, that Sergeant Callahan's quiet obsession was not misplaced, and the threads of past and present might soon weave toward revelation. Ethan, fragile, wary, and haunted, existed in this delicate balance. He was still a shadow, still a survivor, still mentally fragile from years of torment. But the city, slowly, almost imperceptibly, had begun to notice him, and in noticing, the first steps toward truth, reckoning, and eventual resolution had quietly begun. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. The faint signs of Ethan's presence, discarded items, glimpses in the early morning shadows, the subtle traces left by someone who had learned to survive without leaving a footprint, caught the attention of a few persistent observers. Patrol officers noticed patterns. Social workers noted a disheveled man who appeared repeatedly in the same areas. No one yet knew who he was, and certainly no one recognized that the thin, unkempt figure with hollowed eyes was the young man who had vanished years ago from Portland. Yet the threads of connection were forming. Sergeant Callahan, still devoted to the case despite the years, began to follow rumors, minor sightings, and fragmented accounts. A patrol officer reported the man near the waterfront underpass, noting the strange gait, the nervous glances, and the way he seemed to observe without being observed. Callahan took the report seriously. He had long suspected that the young man he had been searching for might still be alive, though the physical evidence had long since vanished. And now, for the first time in years, a tangible clue existed, a living person who might hold the key to unraveling the truth. Callahan's approach was methodical. He knew the years of captivity and isolation would have changed Ethan profoundly. The man who had once been a bright young professional would not simply step back into society. Trauma had shaped him, fear had rewired his instincts, and trust would be nearly impossible to establish. Callahan prepared carefully, approaching not as a police officer immediately demanding answers, but as someone seeking to guide a fragile life back into recognition, to bridge the chasm years of suffering had created. Ethan, for his part, remained cautious. The years of control, abuse, and starvation had left him with a deep distrust of anyone who sought to help. Even the faint glimmer of curiosity in the officer's eyes was perceived as a potential threat. He retreated when approached, vanished when followed, and observed quietly from shadows. Survival was instinctual. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. Each day was a balance between the desire to escape further, to disappear entirely, and the subtle recognition that someone might begin to understand. The first interaction occurred in the gray, cold early hours along the waterfront. Callahan, with the patience honed from decades of experience, approached slowly, maintaining distance, voice calm, measured. "Ethan?" he asked softly, as if testing the waters. The name, spoken after years of silence, carried weight. Ethan froze, instinct and terror colliding with the fragile memory of his past identity. He did not respond, eyes wide, muscles tense, body coiled for flight. Callahan did not advance further. Instead, he spoke in fragments, allowing space, time, and reassurance to seep into the encounter. "You're safe. No one's here to hurt you. I've been looking for you, for years. You're not alone." The words were deliberate, meant to soothe, to anchor, yet Ethan's mind churned with disbelief. Years of survival had taught him that safety was an illusion, that promises were meaningless, and that trust was a dangerous vulnerability. Slowly, over days, Callahan's patience began to erode Ethan's defenses. He learned to wait, to observe without forcing interaction, to allow the man to take incremental steps toward recognition. He provided food discreetly, left supplies nearby, and spoke in soft, consistent tones that carried familiarity without threat. The routine, predictable and gentle, offered Ethan the rare possibility of trust, a thread that had been nearly obliterated by years of captivity and fear. Ethan began to respond cautiously. First, small gestures, accepting food, observing without fleeing, returning glances without panic. Then, tentative communication, muted words, hesitant sentences, fragments of his story. He recounted details of his disappearance selectively, each word measured against the risk of exposure and the fear of consequences from those who had once held power over him. He spoke of captivity, of the man who had taken him, of starvation, forced labor, and isolation. The story, fragmented though it was, began to form a coherent narrative, one that explained years of absence and suffering that had long confounded those who searched for him. Callahan listened, never interrupting, validating each fragment, allowing Ethan's story to emerge at its own pace. The detective understood the delicate balance. Any pressure could shatter the fragile trust. Any impatience could drive the man back into shadows, beyond reach. And yet, the emerging truth was extraordinary. Ethan Cole had survived. He had endured captivity at the hands of a wealthy, dangerous man who had sought retribution for a perceived transgression. He had lived without recognition, invisible, unaccounted for, a ghost in plain sight. As the story unfolded, the detective's investigation gained a new dimension. Leads that had long been dormant suddenly took shape. Patterns emerged, corroborating Ethan's fragmented recollections. Witnesses who had seen the wealthy husband's activities were identified. Connections to local associates, enforcers, and past threats became clearer. The narrative, once obscured by years of absence and silence, began to solidify into actionable understanding. Ethan's emergence into recognition was not without struggle. Years of trauma had altered his behavior, reshaped his perceptions, and instilled deep fear of authority. Even as Callahan guided him, the young man wrestled with guilt, shame, and the impossibility of reintegration. Memories of family, of ordinary life, collided with the harsh reality of what he had endured. Yet, slowly, he began to navigate these emotions, recounting more, moving cautiously toward a tentative re-entry into society. The wealthy husband, whose control had seemed absolute, became the focus of investigation. Details emerged of threats, coercion, and intimidation designed to enforce silence and compliance. Callahan compiled evidence meticulously, using Ethan's recollections as a foundation. Surveillance, Interviews, financial records, and other traces were assembled to reconstruct the network of control, to illuminate the mechanisms of power that had kept Ethan hidden for so long. The confrontation, when it came, was quiet yet undeniable. Authorities moved carefully, ensuring Ethan's safety while addressing the dangerous man who had imposed years of suffering. The wealthy husband's facade of control unraveled as investigators presented evidence, corroborated by the surviving victim's testimony. It was a reckoning, not of spectacle, but of justice quietly asserting itself against years of fear and domination. Ethan's mental fragility remained. Even as the investigation progressed, he wrestled with the enormity of recognition, the reality of exposure, and the complex mix of relief, guilt, and trauma. Survival had defined him for years. Now the possibility of life beyond invisibility demanded new skills, new trust, and new hope. The journey from ghost to recognized victim was incremental, fragile, and painstakingly slow. Yet the story, once fragmented across years and shadowed by uncertainty, now moved toward resolution. Calls to friends and family were carefully mediated. Visits to familiar locations, once forbidden by fear, became manageable with support. Ethan's narrative, once invisible, began to intersect with the world that had never forgotten him entirely. The city, too, began to perceive him differently. Those who had overlooked the ghost in the alleys now saw a survivor. The fragments of human interaction, once threatening, became small steps toward acknowledgement, toward re-entry, toward reclaiming a life stolen by fear and power. And through it all, Sergeant Callahan remained the quiet, patient bridge, guiding Ethan's emergence without force, validating his experiences, and ensuring that the fragile trust of years spent in hiding was not shattered in a single misstep. Ethan Cole, once invisible, once trapped, now began to exist in the world again. He walked cautiously among those who had once assumed he was gone forever. He recounted the horrors endured, collaborated with authorities to pursue justice, and slowly began to integrate the fragments of trauma into a narrative of survival and recognition. The confrontation had revealed more than the past, it had illuminated resilience. The man who had been kidnapped, tortured, and hidden had survived against unimaginable odds. His story, once lost to the shadows, now emerged as a testament to endurance, courage, and the painstaking work required to navigate trauma, regain agency, and reclaim recognition. Ethan's story, pieced together through patience, careful observation, and relentless pursuit of truth, was no longer invisible. It existed in the awareness of the detective, in the records of investigation, and in the cautious acknowledgement of the city that had once overlooked him. And though his life remained fragile, the first steps towards stability, justice, and reintegration had begun. The stage was set for resolution. The man who had once vanished from Portland had returned, not fully healed, not fully reintegrated, but alive, seen, and no longer invisible. The confrontation and revelation had bridged the gap between years of trauma and the possibility of a future. However tentative, marked by recognition, safety, and the beginnings of understanding. The long shadow of years finally began to lift. Ethan Cole, once invisible to the world, once a ghost haunted by captivity and fear, now stood on the precipice of a life he could cautiously reclaim. The confrontation with the man who had kidnapped and tormented him had ended, not with violence, but with accountability. Authorities had documented every detail, corroborated every fragment of Ethan's recollections, and ensured that the wealthy husband, once untouchable in his circle of influence, faced the consequences of his actions. The courtroom proceedings were meticulous and somber, a stage not for spectacle, but for justice finally asserting itself. Ethan's presence in the courtroom was tentative. Years of trauma, isolation, and survival had reshaped him into someone wary of attention, someone who approached public spaces with caution. He moved quietly, seated in the back, eyes fixed on the proceedings, absorbing each word with a mixture of fear and relief. The man who had once held his life in his hands now faced the weight of law, the unyielding evidence of coercion, threats, and prolonged captivity. Every testimony, every exhibit, every detail recounted by investigators and survivors alike chipped away at the facade of power that had sustained the criminal for so long. The testimony of Ethan himself was careful, measured, and deliberate. He spoke of fear, of hunger, of labor under duress, and of the psychological torment that had reshaped him. Yet his words also conveyed resilience. the unbroken will of a man who had survived against impossible odds. He did not speak of himself as a victim alone, he spoke of survival, endurance, and the necessity of courage in the face of unrelenting threat. The courtroom listened, absorbed in the quiet intensity of his presence, recognizing the truth in the calm, measured way he recounted years of terror. The wealthy husband, facing the gravity of evidence, was unable to maintain the control he had once wielded so effortlessly. Cross-examinations revealed inconsistencies, associates recounted coerced complicity, and the reality of his crimes became undeniable. The legal system, slow but deliberate, ensured that accountability was delivered, not as vengeance, but as acknowledgement of years of stolen freedom, suffering, and human dignity violated. Justice was not instantaneous, but it was complete, a measured reckoning for crimes long hidden in the shadows. Meanwhile, Ethan's family, long mourning a loss they could never truly understand, began a cautious reconnection. Reintegrating was not simple. Years of absence, compounded by trauma and fear, had left a chasm that could not be bridged with words alone. But patience, understanding, and the persistence of love allowed tentative steps. Visits, initially brief and structured, gradually extended as trust began to re-establish itself. Parents who had grieved, moved on, and sold belongings in despair now faced a living, breathing son. Changed, fragile, and haunted, yet unmistakably present. The first moments of reunion were silent, weighted with emotion. Words seemed inadequate, tears fell quietly, hands reached and recoiled, eyes searched for recognition and reassurance. Ethan, fragile and wary, allowed small gestures, embraces, held hands, shared glances, but nothing rushed, nothing forced. The family learned to navigate the delicate balance between relief and respect for the trauma that reshaped their son. Slowly, cautiously, the threads of connection were rewoven. Psychological healing, however, was neither linear nor easy. Ethan's mind, scarred by captivity, starvation, and fear, required careful attention. Therapy, structured support, and gradual exposure to normalcy became the framework for rebuilding a life once shattered. Hypervigilance, distrust, and nightmares persisted, but they were tempered by the constant presence of people who sought not to rush, but to guide, to observe, and to validate his experiences. Each small victory, a safe night of sleep, a meal without fear, a conversation without panic, marked incremental steps toward recovery. The detective, Sergeant Callahan, who had never wavered in pursuit of truth, finally allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. His persistence had not been in vain. The case, long considered cold and unsolvable, had been solved not through dramatic DNA breakthroughs, but through patience, observation, and the careful nurturing of a fragile survivor's trust. The revelation of Ethan's story reshaped the understanding of the case entirely. It was not a disappearance solved by forensic science alone, but by human tenacity, empathy, and the recognition of trauma's complexity. The city itself absorbed the story slowly. Portland, with its ordinary streets and quiet neighborhoods, had witnessed a ghost among them, a man erased from society, yet surviving, unseen but resilient. As awareness of the case grew, local communities, law enforcement, and social workers reflected on the fragility of life, the consequences of unchecked power, and the capacity for human endurance. Ethan's survival became a testament not only to his personal courage, but to the importance of observation, empathy, and persistence in the face of invisible suffering. Ethan's story also reshaped understanding of accountability. The wealthy husband, once confident in his control, now faced public scrutiny and legal consequences. His influence, status, and resources were insufficient to shield him from the truth that had emerged through careful investigation, and the patient emergence of a survivor's voice. Justice, measured and deliberate, affirmed the principle that even the most hidden crimes eventually leave traces, and that survival can transform vulnerability into revelation. In private moments, Ethan reflected on the years lost. He mourned not only the time spent in captivity and the life denied him, but the mental toll of isolation, fear, and invisibility. He recognized the enormity of survival, the instinct, resilience, and adaptability that had kept him alive. And yet he also began to recognize the possibility of living, not merely surviving. Slowly, cautiously, he reclaimed small portions of ordinary life, walks through familiar neighborhoods, brief conversations with strangers, meals shared in relative safety. Each act, ordinary to most, was revolutionary for him. Family life, though tentative, began to normalize. Parents, siblings, and extended family navigated the delicate choreography of reintegration. Ethan's experiences remained a constant undercurrent, a reality that could not be erased or simplified. Yet love, patience, and acknowledgement allowed for growth, healing, and even tentative joy. The process was ongoing, marked by setbacks and small triumphs, yet grounded in the undeniable truth: he was alive, and he had survived what had once seemed impossible. The case itself became a study in human resilience and investigative persistence. Law enforcement documented not only the criminal accountability of the wealthy husband, but the methods by which a victim could survive years of captivity and trauma. Reports emphasized the importance of patient engagement, trauma-informed investigation, and the recognition that survivors' cooperation is often conditional, fragile, and earned through trust rather than demand. The case became a reference point for handling complex disappearances, particularly those involving prolonged abuse and psychological trauma. Ethan's personal journey continued alongside these developments. Slowly, he began to explore work, reconnect with distant friends, and navigate the routines of life he had once taken for granted. The city, which had once seemed threatening, gradually became a space of tentative opportunity, a place where recognition, trust, and small freedoms could coexist with the shadows of memory. His survival, once silent and hidden, now became both narrative and testimony, a story of endurance, courage, and the quiet triumph of life over relentless oppression. Ultimately, the story of Ethan Cole resolved not with drama or spectacle, but with the subtle, profound recognition of human resilience. Justice had been delivered against the man who had controlled and harmed him, yet the true resolution lay in Ethan's survival, emergence, and the reclamation of a life nearly lost. The detective, the family, and the city bore witness to a story that defied simple explanations, a story of trauma, endurance, and the fragile, extraordinary human capacity to survive. Ethan's legacy, though quietly lived, became indelible. He remained cautious, fragile, and profoundly aware of the vulnerability of life. Yet he also embodied resilience, persistence, and the power of patience. Those who had sought him, those who had observed, and those who had survived alongside him understood the depth of the journey. Years of invisibility, captivity, and fear transformed into the painstaking reclamation of life, dignity, and recognition. And in the quiet reflection of Portland streets, where ordinary life continued unaware of the shadows that had passed among them, Ethan Cole existed once more, not fully healed, not fully whole, but alive, recognized, and quietly victorious. His story, now known, offered not just closure to a case once considered cold, but an enduring testament to the resilience of human life and the unwavering pursuit of truth, even in the face of the most profound absence.